Hello, welcome everyone. This is going to be a great presentation today, our very first Stewards of the Beautiful Land webinar, and we are really excited to get things kicked off. Welcome, my name is Jeff Jensen, Director of Community Programs here with Trees Forever, and really pleased to be with you this afternoon. This is our very first Stewards of the Beautiful Land webinar. And so this is going to be a series that is going to continue all the way through September with webinars every 2 weeks. So this is Spring Ephemerals to start us off on the seasons, but we're going to have great presentations. I'll show you a couple in just a minute lined up for us. I want you to save the date for the next couple of webinars coming up here. May 24th, all of our Stewards of the Beautiful Land webinars are going to be over the noon hour from noon till about 1:15 or so if questions go long. But it's going to be an opportunity to really learn about all of these different topics, some featured presenters from woodlands to prairies and everything in between. So get those on your calendar, those dates there. Today, we're going to be talking about spring ephemerals. I want to talk briefly about some of the June field days that are coming up. So Stewards of the Beautiful Land is not only this series of webinars with featured speakers, but a chance to get out, touch and feel the prairie and the woodlands and really experience it through our field days. And those will happen once a month, June, July, August, and September. We right now have 3 different counties and we're just about ready to line up a 4th so that hopefully no matter where you are in the state, you'll be able to come out and join a group of like-minded individuals to learn together, plant ID, tree ID, invasive species removal, you name it. And then just looking ahead, what to expect as we continue with this Stewards of the Beautiful Land series. With that, I would like to introduce Emily Ehley, our field coordinator and program manager out in Illinois. Emily.
Thank you so much, Jeff. All right, we got lots to talk about today, so I will go ahead and get started. As Jeff introduced, my name is Emily Ehley. I'm the Southern and Central Illinois Field Coordinator for Trees Forever. So my disclaimer here is going to be that I am not a botanist. I unfortunately do not have all of the intricacies of flowering plant morphology and physiology down. But I am an enthusiast. So my background is in environmental education. I came to Trees Forever and became a certified arborist. I'm also an Illinois master naturalist and an NAA certified interpretive guide. So I really just love sharing nature and living things with others. So I'm so excited to be here today. So Trees Forever, of course, our mission is to plant and care for trees and the environment by empowering people, building community, and promoting stewardship. And we, of course, have staff in both Illinois and Iowa. I welcome both our Illinois and Iowa friends here today and anyone else who may be joining us as well. Welcome. And so spring is in the air right now. It is one of my favorite times of year. There's so much happening, so much changing going on all at once. And I try to spend as much time as possible outside, seeing it, documenting it, experiencing it. So I'd like to share some of that with you. So we will take a virtual walk in the woods. So just to dip our toes in a little bit, here's a couple nice early spring ephemeral species, our cutleaf toothwort and our spring blue-eyed Mary. The cutleaf toothwort, very distinctive by those deeply lobed leaves. The spring blue-eyed Mary has this fascinating 2-colored flower, which does look a little reminiscent of a violet. When you look at the leaves, you can see those differences there, and they actually are in different genuses and different families too. We have our Virginia bluebells as well, quite a favorite. It has these great tube flowers, which are pollinated by some of our long-tongued native bees and also visited by hummingbirds. So now that we've gotten just a little bit of taste of some of what we're going to be looking at today, brings us to the question, what is a spring ephemeral? A spring ephemeral is going to be a plant that is marked by a short life cycle. That's where that ephemeral word comes in. And the spring meaning that entire life cycle is happening early on in the spring, in between our snow melt in the winter and in the summertime. So basically, what these spring ephemerals have been adapted to do is they are taking advantage of the sunlight on the forest floor in between, as I said, once the snow has melted and before those trees have fully leafed out in the summer. So if you're walking in the woods in the deep summer, you're going to be experiencing, of course, a lot of shade. There's going to be a lot less sun coming through the forest floor. But before those leaves happen, there's quite a bit of sun coming through. So these species are taking advantage of generally just a few weeks to a few months. This will be depending on the exact area that you're in, could be any time from late February throughout March, and then wrapping up generally through May to early June. So this strategy is very common in deciduous forests, of course, because of the way the leaves of the trees work. So a great tool that I love to use is something called iNaturalist. I strongly recommend this tool to anyone who has an interest in not just our flowers, but trees, other plant species, insects, amphibians, all kinds of plants and animals you can use iNaturalist for. And so it is both a mobile app and can be accessed on a desktop as well. So here are some examples that I took last year. So the way it works is I go out, I take a picture, I upload it to iNaturalist, and then the algorithm in iNaturalist makes a prediction about what it thinks this plant might be. So I can select that, or if I already just know the species offhand, I can put that in myself. And then as you can see here on this center one, other people can come along and either confirm the ID that I made or suggest a different ID. And so once more than 2 users have agreed on an ID, then that data is what iNaturalist calls research grade. So scientists, researchers can actually go in, pull this data and use it for their studies, which I love. So not only is this helping me learn and document what I've seen, but it can also be helping scientists as well. So you don't see it in these pictures, but this will save where the observations were taken. So I believe all of these were taken in my area, which is southwestern Illinois. It's going to tell me the common name, for example, a center one, harbinger of spring, the Latin name, which I believe is Erangina bulbosa, but apologies if I didn't get that quite right. And then it's also gonna document that date as well. So these are from 2022 and 2023. I can think, okay, I want to see this prairie trillium blooming, or I want to see this harbinger of spring. When did I see that last year? Okay, late March. And that gives me an indication of when I might see it next time. Which brings us to our next vocabulary word, which is phenology. Phenology is basically nature's calendar. It's known as the study of periodic biological events. So this is going to be things such as, of course, our example here, when a plant is flowering, when its leaves are coming out. It can also be other things such as when birds are migrating, when they're arriving for the season, when they're leaving for the season, when an animal is migrating, when an insect is coming out or moving into its next life stage, things like that. So this information can be documented, it can be studied. Things, of course, in nature are cyclical. So they are typically going to happen more or less the same time each year. So as I was saying with that iNaturalist information, I've been doing this for a few years now, so I can go back and I can see, okay, I typically see this particular plant flower right around late March. And that gives me an idea next time, okay, it's late March, I can go look for that plant. So phenology, it's a really interesting and fun concept. If you have some more looking for some more information about it, the USA Phenology Network is a resource as well, and there's a lot of things out there. There's Project Budburst out of the Chicago Botanical Garden, which does some great community science with that as well. And here's a few more observations that I have because I just love doing this. It's like a little treasure hunt every year, going out and looking for these spring ephemerals on the forest floor. And here's a little preview of some that we're gonna talk about shortly, Virginia Spring Beauty, and one of my favorites, the mayapple. Next buzzword, and this is one of the most fun to say, myrmecochory. So what is myrmecochory? myrmecochory is seed dispersal by ants. And that is important in this context, because about 30 to 40% of these forest wildflowers are myrmecochores, a word that I can almost always stumble over a little bit, meaning that they are species where these seeds are being distributed by ants. And this is an adaptation that we're seeing pretty commonly in those spring ephemerals. And often the way that works is that you're going to have a fatty appendage called an elaiosome. So you see that attached to the outside of the seed, and that's basically there just as an incentive to the ant to take that seed. And so a single ant colony may collect as many as 1,000 seeds over a season. And while that volume of seeds is great, the distance is not as much. So you can imagine some plants spread their seeds by the wind or by birds and are able to travel quite far that way. Of course, if your seed is being distributed by ants, it will not move quite as far. Research found that these seeds are carried on average just about 2 meters from the parent plant. And because of this, because this distribution is so localized, habitat fragmentation is a major threat to the survival of these spring ephemerals. So even if that habitat is being fragmented just a fairly small amount, that can have a really significant effect on the health of these populations. Some of our well-known myrmecochores include wild ginger, bloodroot, and violets. And then if you are really interested in this concept, there's a great episode on the Indefensive Plants podcast called Ants as Seed Dispersers, aka the myrmecochory episode, which goes into a lot of detail about that. And that in general is just a fun podcast with a lot of great information about plants. All right, now let's start diving into some of our great spring ephemeral species. So I've organized these pretty roughly in order of phenology. So basically the order in which you might start to see those. So as where our virtual walk in the woods is also sort of going to be a virtual walk through time, through the spring. So while the initial bloom times might be a little bit different depending on where you are, generally the sequence will be similar. There'll be certain species that will come out sooner and some that will come out later. So as I mentioned, I am based in southwestern Illinois. For folks who are in northern Illinois, far south Illinois, northern Iowa, southern Iowa, that's all going to vary. But this is one of the first ones that I typically see in my area. And this is Dutchman's Breeches. So some identification tips. It has these really distinctive leaves. They're deeply cut, almost fern-like, and then it has this flower stalk, which show these really distinctive white flowers. And of course, this fun name, Dutchman's Breeches, refers to the fact that these flowers almost look like a line of pants hanging on like a clothesline or something like that. So where to see it? This species is going to be common in our deciduous woodlands, often along slopes or in ravines, or even along streams. It doesn't do well with very much disturbance. The flowers are pollinated by bumblebees because their proboscis is long enough to get to the nectar. Honeybees, on the other hand, because they have a shorter proboscis, are able to gather the pollen with their feet, but they're not going to access that nectar. These are going to be one of those myrmecochores distributed by ants. So they have that elaiosome, that fleshy appendage on the seed, which acts as an incentive to the ants. The foliage is toxic to mammals, so it's generally not going to be eaten by them. And in fact, one of its common names is little blue staggers because it was said to cause a drunken staggering in cattle if they ate it, due to the narcotic and toxic substances in this poppy-related genus. So another fun fact about Dutchman's Breeches. And next we have Virginia Spring Beauty. This one I will often see when I'm on a hike early in the spring. I'll see it along a path. It has these long, thin, almost grass-like leaves, and then these wonderful flowers, which are white with almost pink stripes down the middle. It is smaller. The entire plant is usually not going to be more than 4 or so inches tall. You definitely have to be looking for it. This is also going to do well throughout our deciduous woodlands, but can even do slightly more open areas such as savannas, bluffs, and even edges of things like lawns and parks. While it can be found in some prairies, it is primarily a woodland species as well. It can also survive some occasional grazing by cattle. Because of its durability, it's a fairly common species. And because it's one of those really early ones, I really think of it as one of our initial kind of signs of spring. Trout lily, such a fun species. So it does have that really distinctive lily shape to the flower and the leaves. It's got these long sort of spear-shaped leaves. The flowers have 3 petals and 3 sepals. So we're going to have our white trout lily and yellow trout lily are both species that will commonly be encountered in our eastern US deciduous woodlands. These leaves are also very distinctive because of this sort of mottled color to them. And this is also a species that the health of which is really threatened by garlic mustard, which is an invasive species that we're really starting to deal with a lot here in my area in Illinois, and I believe is starting to be an issue throughout the central US and into Iowa as well. These flowers are pollinated by a number of our native bees, including honeybees. Well, honeybees are not our native bees, but mason bees, cuckoo bees, digger bees, plaster bees. And so again, as with the previous one, the longer tongued bees are able to access the nectar, whereas honeybees and some of the shorter tongued bees simply collect the pollen. They have this really distinctive sort of nodding shape to the flower. Sometimes you have to, I will get all the way down onto the forest floor to really get a good look in that flower. And here we have a nice up close picture of one of those bees accessing the flower as well. All right, wild ginger. Wild ginger is a very low colony forming species. It has these really distinctive velvety leaves. And then the flowers are really fascinating. It has this really subtle dark red colored flower very close to the forest floor. And it has been hypothesized that dark red color is to attract flies and bees as pollinators. Additionally, the seeds also have those elastomes to attract ants for dispersal as well. It is called wild ginger because of these very aromatic rhizomes, which have a ginger-like fragrance and flavor. One thing to keep in mind, that leaf shape is somewhat similar to the wild violets that you'll often see this time of year. So here we have an up close of the violet foliage. This picture I took in my backyard. You can see some of those differences between the leaves of the violets and that wild ginger. So first of all, as I said, that wild ginger is very fuzzy. Additionally, it tends to be even a little bit more heart-shaped, though that's not a perfect clue. And then these violet leaves are somewhat more toothed around the edges, whereas that wild ginger has a smooth edge to the leaves. And wild ginger, it's not going to be as common as those violets. Violets, of course, like I said, you might find them in a yard, you might find them in a very disturbed area, whereas wild ginger is more commonly going to be in an undisturbed woodland area. Okay, bellwort. We see here, this is another really interesting growth shape. It has these flowers that are hanging down almost as though it was wilting, but that's actually just a very healthy plant. That's just the way it grows. I have this picture here I took on a hike recently where you can see it surrounded by some of those other spring ephemerals. So we have some of our trillium we'll talk about later. Looks like we got some wild ginger in there. There's also some ferns as well. So you see it as part of that whole ecology of the spring forest floor. This can be really affected by deer browsing, habitat destruction, as well as the incursion of some invasive species such as garlic mustard. And bellwort is going to do well in our deep woodlands, along riverbanks, and shady slopes as well. This species can be a pretty nice indication that this is a pretty undisturbed area. Woodland phlox. The stems are hairy and sticky. A few different specific species. I listed the phlox divaricata here, but there are a couple different species that we're going to see throughout our areas in Illinois and Iowa. These flowers are pollinated by a number of our native bees as well as some moths and butterflies, especially swallowtails. This is a really nice one because it's got this great bluish purple color, which is a little more rare in some of our flowers, and it's always a really nice thing to see. In my area, this is blooming throughout April, and there's still a few of them going right now. And this is always just really a wonderful thing to see out there in the woods. Trillium. There are a number of different trillium species, so it's really going to vary what you're going to see in your area. In my area, I often see prairie trillium. The trillium are very distinctive. It's got that trillium, that tri in there, 3. So you're going to see those 3s in the bracts, which are the leaf-like structure that you're seeing, that central bloom as well. Some additional interesting names are wake robin, toadshade, triflower, birthroot, and birthwort. All fun. I've heard all of those at different times, really regionally. Varies how trillium is referred to. So again, this is another one that's going to be spread by ants and really relying on ants as well as another species exhibiting myrmecochory. All right, now for one of my favorites, the mayapple. So you can see that photo on the right. This is a very colony-forming species. You don't often just see one mayapple by itself. You're often going to see them in these big clumps, really kind of carpeting the forest floor. They have this wonderful umbrella-like shape to the leaves, really distinctive. This one, once you know what to look for, you're going to see it everywhere and you're always going to know it. And then we see on this left, we see this flower, and this is a pretty up close picture to get the flower. And if you look closely, you can see that the flower is sort of at the base of a V of 2 sets of leaves branching off. So what I've read is that the first year that they come up, it's just going to be 1 leaf, and then the next year, once it's ready to reproduce, it will have that V in it, that split, and then we'll get that flower. So they have this wonderful white flower. I really recommend going and looking for it. Here, the blooms, in my area, the blooms are wrapping up, but if you're further north, you'll probably still be able to see them. This flower will turn into a fruit, and that is the apple that is being referred to here. And disclaimer, I do not recommend eating these. They are somewhat toxic, but they are eaten by a lot of our woodland wildlife. Turtles particularly like to eat them, which I think is just wonderful. So I definitely kind of track the spring through the mayapples. When they first come up, they kind of look like a closed umbrella, really just kind of the leaves furled around each other that opens up. And then we get those flowers blooming and then into the fruit and seeing it develop. So on my hikes in the spring, I will go through and consistently check to see which stage the mayapple are in. And so these seeds are also, because they're being eaten by a number of species, including some of our mammals like possums and raccoons, these seeds are also being distributed by the animals as well, who are of course eating the fruit and then pooping out the seeds later, and then that helps distribute the plant. All right, wild geranium. We're going to see these large, deeply cut, somewhat fuzzy leaves. Lovely bright flowers as well. So it has quite a bit of similarity to the domesticated geraniums you might be familiar with. So this one is a pretty fun and easy one to ID as well. This does well in a number of different habitats, including woodlands, savannas, meadows, hillsides, glades, and can really make itself at home in a number of different areas. It also attracts quite a range of pollinators, including bees, butterflies, and also some beetles as well. There are also some caterpillars of moth species that feed on the wild geranium as well. So this is a really important piece of that ecosystem for quite a few different species. Also, chipmunks have been known to eat the seeds, and white-tailed deer have been known to eat the leaves as well. Bloodroot, this one has an absolutely fantastic flower. I just love the way that these look, especially against the forest floor when it's just sort of, dull in the early spring. Has these very showy flowers. They're also very short-lived. So again, it's that treasure hunt, trying to find them just in time. They're generally going to be white, though there is also a light pink variation that can sometimes be encountered as well. Also, I've read that some indigenous people would actually create a red dye from the rhizomes, which is that underground portion. Many uses were made from the juice, the sap coming from the plants, because it was believed to have antibacterial properties. And this is going to be found along rivers, streams, and in rich deciduous woodlands. They are also, as we mentioned earlier, distributed by ants. However, because of toxicity in the foliage, they are not typically eaten by mammals. Shooting star, not as much of a deep woodland species, more of a prairie species, but it is another one of our spring wildflowers. So it's a fun one to look at as well. Has these really distinctive flowers sort of point down, which is what makes it look like a shooting star, thus that common name. The color can be quite variable, ranging from white to pink to light purple. They are one of our native species, benefit from buzz pollination of bumblebees, which is a distinctive adaptation of a number of our different North American flowering plants. That is also eaten some mammals as well, such as deer. All right, I want to give a little pause now, Jeff, in case we want to take any questions, and then we will move into some of our flowering tree species.
Thanks, Emily. And we do have a couple of questions here. One of the questions is the wild ginger leaf the same size as violet leaves?
Good question. I think the wild ginger leaf is going to be a little bit bigger, slightly, than the violet leaf, but they are fairly similar in size. The other thing I think is that the violet leaves are typically closer to the ground. So we can see in this picture here, there's some wild ginger in there. Those stalks are holding those leaves a little bit further off the ground, which is another way that you can sort of differentiate it from that violet.
So violet leaves are closer to the ground, or the ginger leaves?
The violet leaves, I think, are typically a little bit closer to the ground.
Great, thank you. Okay, and then Carrie wanted to know any tips or resources on harvesting seed from spring ephemerals. For example, when seed is ripe, but before it disappears. Other than columbine, harvesting spring seed seems to be more challenging, and spring ephemeral seed seems to be more expensive than seed collected in the fall.
Good question.
Well, that's actually a great segue because, folks, I actually put some resources in the questions tab to share with you all. These resources will also be sent as a follow-up PDF along with the link for the recorded presentation. But just wanted to point that out. But I'm not sure that any of them explicitly answer your question, Carrie. Thoughts, Emily?
So I personally don't have experience propagating these spring ephemeral species. I typically just go out and observe them in the wild. I know that there are some native plant nurseries where you can buy some of these from, but in terms of growing them from seed, that's a great question. That might be one of those ones we might have to do a little bit more research into because that's not something I know a lot about.
I think that's all the questions. Oh, no, just at the last second here, Ruth sends one. Do the trillium cross-pollinate in close proximity?
That's a great question. I would think so. I think often the trillium species are really differentiated just by habitat and where they're growing. I would suspect that there is some hybridization, though I don't have any precise research about that in front of me right now. That's another great question.
Thank you, Ruth.
So those were our spring ephemeral species. Again, those species that are small, herbaceous perennial species, meaning they are coming up, doing their full life cycle, and then dying back, and then doing it again the following year. But they are not the only flowering thing in the spring. We also have some wonderful native flowering tree species as well. So our next fun vocab word of the day is hysteranthus. And hysteranthus basically just means that those flowers are appearing before the leaves. So in most plants, you are pretty commonly in our area, they're going to be synthanthus, meaning that you're seeing flowers and leaves at the same time. Often those leaves are appearing first and the flowers later. But with some of these spring flowering trees, we're going to see those flowers first. And a great example, as we'll see shortly, is going to be another one of my favorites, the redbud. As I said before, the exact dates, months, times is going to vary a little bit depending on where you live, but generally the sequence will be more or less the same. So that might shift back or forth a few months, depending on what zone you're in, but generally you'll kind of be able to see things in more or less the same order. So we're seeing very early in the spring, we're going to see our witch hazel bloom, one of our wonderful flowering native shrubs. After that, we're going to see the American hazelnut. We are going to see red maples, redbuds, serviceberries, and dogwoods. And these are going to be some of our very first spring blooming trees. And of course, there's quite a few that will bloom a little bit later in the year, but these are some of our really early indicators of spring. So what do they look like? This is a witch hazel. I took this picture in a park in St. Louis, Missouri, but I actually have one in my front yard as well that bloomed for the first time this year, and I was very, very excited. This is really unique in that it's really a winter blooming species. So we're going to see these flowers sometimes as early as November. I've seen them, but often in my area, at least, they'll be blooming like January, February. So it's really nice. They've got this lovely color. It's really distinctive shape, and it's really just like the only thing blooming against the gray of the late winter. So it's always just a joy to find. This is a very close-up picture. These flowers are really small. You need to get really, really close to really get a good look at them, but it's definitely worth it. American hazelnut. And any questions that you have about American hazelnut or any other nut-producing species will be directed to Jeff. But this is also from my front yard. I have a smaller yard, so I don't have a lot of room for trees, unfortunately, but I've tried to really pack it with some great native shrubs. So these three pictures here, they're all of the same shrub. And then the center one got as close as I could with my very limited photography skills to get a picture of those actual blooms, because they're very, very, very subtle. But you can see this wonderful little red color there on the tips. That, I believe, was in March. So if you didn't get to see it this year, that window is probably past, but definitely keep an eye out for it next year because it's a really fun one. Red maple, I absolutely love red maple blossoms. Red maple is a very common tree in our eastern wooded areas. It's often going to be in bottomlands and floodplains, but can often be found on slopes and hillsides as well. It does get pretty tall, and so often you won't be able to see it as up close as this picture. What you'll see is you'll just be looking at the treetops. There won't be any leaves yet. It'll just be gray, and then you'll just see these like bright reddish pink blobs along the edges of the trees. And I absolutely love seeing that. It's often going to be like late February, early March, really one of the first blooming things that you'll see. And it's always such an exciting find. And then of course we have our redbud. It's a really beloved small flowering tree, really commonly planted in landscapes. It also has wonderful heart-shaped leaves, which are just fun to look at throughout the year. But the pink flowers are really distinctive because, next vocab word, they exhibit cauliflory, which is when a flower and or fruit grows directly on the main branches and trunk instead of being held separately on like a little stem. So another fun fact about this is that the vegetable cauliflower is actually not coniferous because it is arising from that main flower stalk. So fun fact, redbud, coniferous, cauliflower, not coniferous. Redbud is actually a legume, so it's somewhat related to things like beans, peas. So you'll see when eventually its fruit comes out, there sort of looks like a little pod, like a little pea pod. Serviceberry, there's several different serviceberry species, but it ranges from a small to quite large flowering shrub. It's got these wonderful white flowers pretty early in the spring. I think mine in my backyard is typically going to be like late March to early April. And then after the flowers, we'll have these lovely little berries. They almost look like small pinkish blueberries. And the birds absolutely love those. I'll see the berries start to ripen, and then within a day or two, they're all gone because the birds get them really fast. And then, of course, there is flowering dogwood. This is one of my absolute favorite flowers, trees, everything. Really distinctive understory tree throughout our eastern deciduous forests. It has a really distinctive growth shape in that it sort of grows flattened out to catch every bit of light that it can coming through the overstory trees. And it has these absolutely wonderful flowers as well. There are a few different species of dogwoods. Some of them are going to be a little bit shrubbier, but this, and we'll have different flowers as well. This is going to be our flowering dogwood, our Cornus florida, and it has those really distinctive white flowers on it. All right, and then just a warning, not all of the flowers are friends. I mentioned the garlic mustard a little bit earlier. The invasives in your particular area will vary. I know when I lived in Chicago, we had a lot of issue with buckthorn. Here where I live now, we have a lot of issues with invasive bush honeysuckle. And of course, the problem with these invasive species is that they are really crowding out some of these pretty delicate native species and making it not possible for their populations to grow and thrive. So this one you might be familiar with, Bradford or Callery pear. You will see it along roadways commonly. In the earlier spring, got these fun white flowers from a distance up close. The smell is pretty horrible. It's been likened to rotting fish. This was an extremely popular species for sort of urban forestry. About a couple decades ago, it was planted super commonly, and then unfortunately a number of issues arose. The smell, of course, the fact that it turned out not to be sterile and started to become invasive, and the wood being fairly weak, and the trees tend to fall apart in storms and cause all kinds of damage. So while the flowers are really nice, this is definitely not ideal, and I absolutely do not recommend planting them, and do recommend taking them out if you encounter one and are able to. All right, so we are coming to the end of our walk in the woods. Just a few other notes. We mentioned a little bit about native plant landscaping earlier. Some of this will be in that resource list that Jeff mentioned. But if you're interested in native plant landscaping and haven't already, I highly recommend checking out Dr. Doug Palamy's work. He is an entomologist at the University of Delaware, and he's written a number of books on the subject, including Bringing Nature Home, Nature's Best Hope, and The Ecology of Oaks. He also has something called the Homegrown National Park Initiative. There's a website there, and this basically is the concept that if we were to convert all of our lawns and yards into habitat, it could function as basically the largest national park. And so while small fragmented pieces of habitat aren't going to be ideal for larger species, for our megafauna, they are really important for things like insects, things like birds, of course. So you are supporting these species and also getting to have the joy of observing them in your yard. Things like butterflies, moths, birds, really, really fun to watch. So we did a number of different research projects, finding and comparing the quantity of animal larvae, caterpillars, etc., on different species, and found that oaks host the highest number of butterfly and moth species, and then some other ones as well, such as black cherry, willow, birch, poplar, crabapple, blueberry, and maple, are all hosting quite a lot as well. So if you are really interested in providing habitat, these are some great species to consider. And another one of our great resources is this native plant finder. So whether you're looking for a tree, shrub, an herbaceous perennial, a grass, what have you, You can use this tool. You'll put in your zip code and it will help you find specifically which species are going to be native in your area. And we'll tell you as well how many of those butterfly and moth species they're going to support as well. All right, so thank you so much for joining us. Again, my name is Emily Ehley. If you are interested in learning more about trees forever, you can follow us on any social media. You can go to our website. And of course, you can stay tuned for those future webinars that Jeff had mentioned earlier.
Thank you, Emily. Well, we are getting to the portion here where we have some questions, but before that, I'm going to pull this up. A couple of things before we get to the questions. Hey, Mother's Day is coming up. So what's the best flower for a boy to give his mom for Mother's Day? Any thoughts out there? Well, of course, the answer that we all know is sunflowers. Sunflowers. So something to brighten up your day. That's a fun little pun. Hey, we have some upcoming webinars that I want to make you aware of. We have in 2 weeks a panel Q&A with some prairie professionals, some really interesting folks. Even our own Christine, not our own, UNI's Tallgrass Prairie Centers, Christine Nemec, who we work with closely. She's going to be a part of a panel with some other folks, and so we're really excited about that. And then we're going to move right into landscaping for water quality, and so I think that'll tie nicely into that last screen, or one of those last screens that Emily brought up with Doug Tallamy. And so this is all about trying to take landscaping in our yard and other places and really convert it into some natives and others for water quality purposes. And Josh Balk with the Blackhawk County SWCD is going to be with us. And then field days. So we all want to get out and enjoy the outdoors and see and feel and touch. And so we have a lot of field days coming up, 3 right now. We're working on another one here in June. We're going to be in Carroll County, a woodland walk there. We're going to be up in Okoboji, Dickinson County, for a walk in the woods, and then down in Mahaska County with some prairie ID and pollinator gardens. So if you can attend, those are going to be a lot of fun. Check out the Stewards of the Beautiful Land website. That's going to have all sorts of great details. Let's see if we have any questions here. We did get an answer on the trillium, cross-pollination in close proximity. Trilliums need a courier, like an insect, to help with pollination. So they're insect pollinated. They're not wind pollinated. So the closer proximity may help because they're just closer for the insects to get to, but they're not wind pollinated. So the other thing that I found when I Googled it quick was that even flies have been observed visiting the trilliums. So a pretty wide range of insects that might be paying a visit. Okay, well, I'm not seeing any more questions, so I am going to take a real quick, a minute and a half maybe, and I want to actually show you the website here. Stewards of the Beautiful Land, this is the web page. So this is going to be the landing page essentially for our program throughout the summer here. So you can see some of the different presentations coming up, and you can actually get registered for those. We have information down here about our in-person field days and walkabouts. Those are listed. This is also where we'll be putting links for the recorded presentations for you to access and some other things like that. And then I also wanted to definitely plug here the UNI Tallgrass Prairie Center. So this is a great partner of ours for the Stewards of the Beautiful Land, and they have some fantastic resources that really you need to be aware of. So, well, I'm not going to go into all of them because this could actually be a whole presentation in and of itself. But I just wanted to point out the roadside programs, great information there. Prairie on the farms, a lot of good stuff there. Yeah, I just can't say enough about the website. So spend a little time, familiarize yourself, great resources. Oh, and we might have found a question. Are there any field trips in Illinois? Oh, shoot. Well, not yet, but since you asked, I think we'll have to at least look at it. So I'll talk with Emily and Debbie and see if there might be an opportunity for some sort of a field day out there later this summer, but nothing set up on a month-to-month basis in Illinois. And there's not really anything close across the river. Apologies, Mr. Pusateri, but keep on checking into our webinars, and hopefully there'll be some content there that'll be valuable to you and worth checking out. All right, I want to thank everyone for joining us. Again, 2 weeks, we're going to be meeting again. Check out the website for Stewards of the Beautiful Land for all the details. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Take care now.